Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bassam Haddad, and I am very excited to be joined by my guest host, Makarim Al Jamal, on this episode 3 of Search Files podcast. And we are both doubly. Hi, Makarim, first. Welcome to
Hi, thanks.
Search Files.
Yeah, I'm glad to be on and it's exciting to have a bit more Messby direct involvement with the podcast.
Absolutely. We will say a lot about what is MESP and what's KPP, but also I would like to welcome our fantastic guests, Girish Daswani and Ahmad Barclay, who are joining us to address episode 3 of Search Files on Decolonizing Anthropology and opening Palestine Maps. Ahlan wa sahlan, Girish and Ahmad.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. You folks have been remarkable in joining us on relatively short notice. We are very excited about the current episodes. Let me say a couple of things about what we are doing with Search Files. Essentially, Search Files is a podcast that addresses knowledge production on the Middle East and matters of pedagogy in relation to the Middle East. And this is our third podcast. We started this podcast last fall with Jessica Holland, who will be in and out of the hosting. I might also be in and out, and Mikarim now is joining us to be our guest host. We have hosted a number of individuals addressing literally those two topics, and KPP stands for Knowledge Production Project. MESP stands for the Middle East Studies Pedagogy Initiative, and you can find all this material when this post is actually published. It will be published on Jadaliya and beyond, and I will also include links in the Facebook feed. Essentially, knowledgeproduction.com is where you can follow the news and updates and the new data visualization for knowledge production project, and Middle East Studies Pedagogy Initiative is at MESPI, MESPI.org, where you can access the latest and a huge archive of tools that we have been preparing for perhaps a decade or two, some say three, on for educators on teaching the Middle East. And this also applies to researchers, students, anybody who would like to access this database. It is available at mespi.org. This is again the third episode, and I would like to welcome Makarim Al Jamal to take it from here and introduce our guests, or at least share with us her thoughts on joining this podcast.
No, I'm really excited. It's great. A lot of these stuff that we do on Messby bridges with KPP, and it's great to have a chance to talk with educators in the field and how they're dealing with a lot of these questions that we're going to bring up today. So without further ado, I think it'd be great to start into the conversation, starting with our first guest, Girish Daswani, who's an Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Toronto, which is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant and home to many Indigenous peoples, including the Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. He is currently working on activist, artistic, and religious responses to political corruption in Ghana. His public-facing work has explored the ways in which colonialism, Orientalism, and imperialism have impacted and are still impacting popular politics, the university, and the field of anthropology. And so, Girish, you gave us some phenomenal articles from Everyday Orientalism, which we'll be sure to link in the post when this is up, and as well as in the Facebook feed. And I was wondering if you could take some time to start to explain, what does decolonizing mean to you? How did you come to both realize its central place in your work and how to actually incorporate it? Because as many of these posts mentioned, decolonizing is thrown around in so many different ways without some gravity and depth into, like, what does it actually look like?
Thank you so much for that question and for the introduction and for also having me and having this wonderful podcast. That's a lot of a lot to think about. But I would start with the question of, what does decolonizing mean to me? And I mean, one thing we have to say is that decolonizing doesn't mean one thing, because we have to think about it within the context of the histories and the peoples in which we are speaking of. So decolonization has been a very frequently used term more recently, especially by university administration or administrators within thinking about decolonizing the syllabi, thinking about decolonizing disciplines, or even decolonizing the university. And I must say that this word, as you said, has been thrown around a lot. For me personally, decolonizing really has come to mean a kind of a problem which cannot easily be resolved because it's not a metaphor that one will use to speak about things that can be done unless we actually get to speak about land relations. Because unless you think about access to land, indigenous forms of access to land, as well as the violence that has taken place through colonialism, we cannot actually speak about decolonizing anything. So a lot of the ways in which the university performs decolonization is really a performance. The ways in which we talk about decolonizing anthropology or the syllabus or academia cannot get to the root or the heart of what it means unless we actually seriously consider whose land we're on, we have come to acquire the knowledge that we have in terms of how we teach, how we reproduce a knowledge through the texts and the books that we produce, and how we actually access the information from the people that we study or from the groups that we claim to be representing. So, in short, good intentions are not really good enough. Like, we can claim to be good, doing good things with this word, but it's not really doing much or basically anything at all if we don't actually seriously consider the structures that are still in place. So the structures that are linked to colonialism, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that point that you're bringing about land seems to be very key. And me not being an anthropologist, but thinking about the process of going and doing field work and what does it mean to be inhabiting a different space, and how do you see that as playing out in decolonizing anthropology, specifically that field work model, and how that changes people's relationship to land that they do their academic work on, which may be different from the spaces that they research.
Yeah, I mean, I think in all kinds of research, like, for example, in anthropology, we're expected to go to foreign countries or to spaces in which that we are not usually familiar with, but then which we become acquainted with over time through learning languages, learning more about the people and the places and the cultures. But there's something still very colonial about this kind of idea of going somewhere and extracting or receiving information and then basically reproducing it as a form of knowledge through books and publications. A lot of the times we see ourselves as generating information, generating knowledge about people, usually people that live in worlds or systems or cultures that the Western world is not usually familiar with. But at the same time, there's still a sense of soft colonialism or a kind of extractive mindset, which comes into play because we're still taking, even though we usually have the permission of the people that we work with. It's still a very unequal relationship and unequal power relationship in which the anthropologist goes to a place, claims to have the expertise that the people there do not, to then represent them to the world in ways that also depend on how I choose to use theories, knowledge, which usually comes from the West. So even the ideas and the theories that I use to apply to a place usually comes from a European Western philosophers. So this is problematic. Anthropologists are still trying to come to terms with this idea of how we acquire knowledge, but I don't think we've actually come to address the heart of it, which is really that we can't solve the problem. It's not going to be solved. I think we have to actually come to terms with the fact that we're stuck in this supposition where we want to believe we're doing good things, but actually we're still a part of a kind of a colonial kind of infrastructure that we can't get out of, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah. And I think that infrastructure then, you continue to use these materials that are being produced in the classroom. So when you get to the classroom and you're teaching these materials, how then do you choose to incorporate these conversations with your students? And I'm curious to hear what the difference and is between teaching these materials and teaching what it means to move towards decolonizing anthropology between the undergraduate and graduate levels, since they're engaged in it very differently.
Yeah, those are good questions. I mean, firstly, let me just say that um, I wrote a blog post called the impossibility of decolonizing anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
As much as I am an anthropologist who loves what I do and who thinks that there's still a future for anthropology, I do believe that we can't decolonize something that is built around colonial relationships, that are built around infrastructures and institutions that maintain colonial relations to land and people. Uh, so where I am in North America, in Canada, or where I work in Ghana, or where I'm from in Singapore, we think we've moved on, but a lot of the infrastructures, the access to land is still very much within a certain colonial framework. So
Mm-hmm.
in teaching what I teach, I tend to bring my students to a point of to a place where they can actually ask these questions. They're not meant to just receive knowledge without
Mm-hmm.
being critical of the knowledge that they receive. So in the undergraduate classroom, I tend to use texts which are not just simply. I mean, I try not to say that we shouldn't read the classic texts within anthropology, but I include books or texts by largely indigenous authors,
Mm-hmm.
feminist authors, black authors, basically authors of who think critically around colonialism. So even though I teach anthropology, I get my students to think about what it means to them personally. So make it something that they need to think about in terms of the colonial histories that they are connected to. So whether they come from parts of the African continent or the Middle East or Southeast Asia or South Asia, all these places are already a part of the colonial fabric in which we make sense of who we are, right?
Mm-hmm.
And make them question these connections, which they don't normally do because they're always thinking um, usually of the nation state as a starting point. Like we come from these countries. So to go backward a bit, think about the colonial relationships that came to create the nation state and the identities through which they have built themselves and their own perspectives. Start from there and ask them to question what it means belong to belong
Mm-hmm.
to a place, identify with a place, to the histories which inform them as to who they are. Because a lot of the times we don't actually question how we come to see ourselves, whether through categories of race, categories of nationality or religion or gender. We assume things all the time. So that's how I thought. And there's obviously a difference between the undergraduate and the graduate uh, teaching. But I think thinking creatively through art, through um, yeah, just through thinking creatively outside the text, which
Mm-hmm.
comes usually with a certain baggage, I think is a good way to begin.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment you're making about thinking outside of the text. And we always hear about frustrating moments in the classroom, and I'm wondering if you could just give us a little sneak peek into your classroom of how you've been able to use these items beyond the text, the artistic representations, to get at this concept.
Sure. So what I tend to do in the classroom, I've taught a few classes now where I use a kind of artistic projects, and throughout my course, I would play songs or music that come from different parts of the world, usually linked to forms of activism or songs or music that questions kind of legacies of colonialism. And then I get them to think about a project through which the students can actually represent these different kind of understandings of what home or belonging or colonial relationships mean through spoken word, poetry, painting, political cartoons, um, forms of for creative work that are not just limited to having to read or reproduce the written word in the
Mhm.
standard format in which we usually find it, which is through these books or texts in which we do read, but which limits us to only think about expressing these very, uh, very difficult uh, histories and relationships in very particular ways. So yeah, I mean, some of the wonderful things I've learned from my students is when they actually start to write in a different way. When they write a poetry, when they write songs or spoken word pieces, when they draw or paint something about home, which is also about race and colonialism and migration or movement, that doesn't get captured when they write a standard paper. Yeah.
Right. It's encouraging to hear that you're incorporating other forms of assignments that also mirror the way that you're incorporating materials that are part of the teaching of anthropology. I guess
Yeah.
another question, kind of going a little bit off from this point of the classroom, is that many faculty members wear so many different hats. So as you are an instructor in a classroom, you're also mentor to a graduate student outside of the classroom, and you've had those administrative positions, and you open the conversation with pointing out about how a lot of this is performative. And I'm curious if you would be willing to talk about how decolonizing anthropology had its place while you were a chair, and how that kind of changed, either changed or impacted the way that you view the future of anthropology, or the work that still is left to be done.
Thank you for that question. So I started thinking about these questions when I was chair of the Diversity and Decolonization Committee in my department here at the University of Toronto. And firstly, the word decolonization should not be used for the committee because we're not actually decolonizing anything. Apart from the term adds a certain value to a certain branding, my work has then been about unlearning rather than learning. So through thinking through or talking to and being in relationships with um, scholars who are usually scholars of color, indigenous, and black scholars, I tend to have, and also basically feminist and women scholars, I have had to unlearn some of the assumptions of what academia is about. And some of these assumptions is this idea that we need to um, reproduce a certain kind of knowledge that um, is about rather reproducing the institutions in which we are in, rather than actually questioning the power relationships in which these institutions are built on. So I've since being chair of this particular committee, I started to question anthropology itself, some of the ways in which we reproduce power relationships, we reproduce a prestige and class in
Mhm.
violent ways or in ways that are not necessarily productive to thinking about social justice or true equity. I've seen people in anthropology reproduce forms of um, a misogyny and a patriarchy that obviously doesn't represent who I want to be or how I want to identify as an anthropologist. So
Mhm.
then this led me to question, what are we doing here? Why are we claiming to be questioning or talking about power, but we're reproducing these same kinds of relationships within our disciplines, within the university? So I started to ask these questions and I took it beyond anthropology. And I started to also ask these questions within my university, and how funding or donations were being made to exclude certain questions around, for example, Palestine. How people who study certain subjects that are deemed to be too politically sensitive because donors deem them so, um, makes the university basically complicit in the same kinds of power dynamics and abuses of the power that we find in governments, we find, you know, basically in the places that we study. So I started to make the discipline and the university spaces through which I could actually study how power operates and how certain topics become occluded. So, for example, how Palestine is seen to be the exception to how what we can talk about, or how there was recently the case at my university where this esteemed potential colleague who was about to be hired, Dr. Azarova, was then not given the job because of her politics, because of what she studied, which was Palestine, Israel, and the Palestinian Israel question became a question that was dependent on how the donors through which the university depends on deemed certain types of questions basically uh, inappropriate. And so when people are, for example, studying Palestine or questioning the authority of the Israeli occupation, that becomes a problem. And so that for me was very, very interesting. So I started to push against that, ask questions, and see how the university actually works in allowing for these silences and occlusions to take place.
Mhm. Great. I know that Bassam has one question that he wants to get in before we start bringing you both on, because I think there's so many, as you've linked very wonderfully to Ahmed's work on Palestine. So Bassam, I'll let you sneak in here, so I haven't taken over the conversation.
No, I actually am very happy you are. This is, I was actually very happy to continue listening, and we always face this when we could actually have a whole hour with each guest. But the way the world works right now, this doesn't work very well always, in terms of the options that everyone has. So we're trying to pack as much as possible. So apologies for moving faster than is than is probably sound. My question, Girish, is very pedestrian, and it is to ask you to tell us briefly, when somebody hears the word decolonizing, and we're talking about people who are not into the literature, and these could be people that actually teach courses that are in the social and political and anthropological fields, but they're not really, either convinced, they haven't been approached, or they didn't approach the topic. So how best to explain this concept, this term, and what it signifies in layperson's terms? It's something
Sure.
that I
That's a good
struggle with in
question.
class,
Yeah,
because yeah.
I think when we think about decolonizing anything, especially within academia, we tend to think about adding more non-white people into our readings. We tend to think about basically equity, diversity, and inclusion in ways of better representing non-white or non-majority populations within our institutions and our syllabi. We think about um, talking about race or colonialism in our classes, talking about histories of violence. So these are the things we tend to think about. But in many ways, performing these acts of talking about decolonization is one thing, but it doesn't get to the heart of what a lot of indigenous people or people whose lands have been who have experienced either genocide, whose lands have been stolen and continue to be stolen. It doesn't actually engage with their concerns when you talk about decolonization. So when you talk about decolonization in Canada, it doesn't address the concerns of land. That land is still being occupied by a group of people who stole it or took it without appropriate legal recourse, and still being used to build their institutions and the nations around which through profit is made. So we don't think about what this means in terms of proper ethical land relations. How are we, how do people actually have access to water resources, and the things that are actually part of the land? So I think that there's one question of, yeah, let's talk about decolonizing academia, but it's just touching the surface and it doesn't get to the root of a lot of the ideas around which decolonization, especially in the settler colonial states, for example, spaces like where I am now in Canada, it doesn't talk about the fact that people are still a part of an ongoing process of where land is still taken away and stolen, and no reparations are made. In fact, it's just a performance of, I'm sorry, but I'm still going to continue to take what I want. So if you get what I mean, I'm trying to say that decolonization tends to be about addressing issues of the past, but it's not in the past. It's
Yeah.
still happening right now. So if we cannot address what's happening right now, then we're not doing anything.
Yeah.
That's
I
all. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. Good thing it's on video, so I can go back and take some pointers. I often share that decolonizing also is very much what you were saying, and I try to encapsulate it with words such as bringing back history and its implications for the present, right? Which is the last point you made, because it's not just bringing back history and letting people, asking people to become more and more aware of what that history was and how we got here, but also its implications for the current moment, because there are strands of colonialism that continue, including what you shared, soft colonialism, very nice word, term. Um, as well as looking at how within that history, how power relations, focusing on the question of who had the power and how that affected the production of knowledge that we receive today and take today as granted, as basically scientific knowledge or proper and sound knowledge. So this is wonderful. Thank you very much for this. And with that, I think we are going to switch to Ahmed, and we would love for you folks to be in conversation with each other. But before that, I think Makarim has a did you know question.
Yeah, we have so many of these phenomenal databases at KPP, and sometimes you can get bogged down in like the amount of information that it contains. So we like to have these little tidbits of facts of things that are pulled out, factoids that are pulled out from this massive database. So coming from our dissertations database, did you know that the number of dissertations written about Iraq between the years of 2003 and 2010 nearly doubled, going from 163 to 340. So we see how within span of 7 years, nearly doubling the amount of dissertations. And that 163 is going back to, I believe, about the 1972, if that's the beginning of our database.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mikael. We have a few of these, and you could actually look at search.knowledgeproduction.com, which we will have on the ticker in a bit, to see what might interest you at the Knowledge Production Project search database or data visualization of our databases. And that is something that we are developing constantly. And you will see some things in 2022 which speak to what you can do with this database in ways, or these databases in ways that we haven't before. All right, with that, thank you, Makarim, and thanks, Girish. And I will switch to Ahmad Barclay, who has been very patiently waiting and did not take the option of joining us at 1:30. He said he wants to be there from the very beginning. أهلا وسهلا أحمد.
Hi, Bassam. Hi,
كيفك؟
Makaram. Hi, Girish.
Uh,
I'm doing well.
That's that's awesome. I'm going to introduce you formally so that people can know the beautiful things that you've done, and then we'll start the conversation. Ahmed, whom I know and visited in Beirut with his lovely family, is an architect and UX designer engaged in projects involving data visualization, visual storytelling, and learning through play. He has led award winning infographics projects as a partner with Visualizing Impact, initiated the open data project Palestine Open Maps, contributed to a variety of publications, and facilitated courses and workshops based on his practices in Beirut, London, Lisbon, Amman, and Bangalore. Ahmed is presently leading data visualization work for the 2021 census at the Office of the National Statistics in the UK. So, with that, Ahmed, we have raised the expectations tremendously as to what you will be sharing with us. And I understand that we have a few images as well that we can pop in as anytime you'd like. I can easily insert them to refer to what you're addressing. And we'd like to start with another, of course, conversation that will require more than half an hour, but we'll try to stick to about half an hour. Can you start, Ahmed, by telling us a little bit about where the idea for Palestine Open Maps came from, how it emerged?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, Palestine Open Maps. It's one of like a quite a number of projects that I worked on in my time with Visualizing Palestine and Visualizing Impact, and basically it was a little bit out of the ordinary for the work we were doing at the time, which was very much kind of infographic based and kind of very much based in present day data um, on Palestine and Palestinians. And yeah, the project, it came out of kind of discovering actually that these set of historical British maps of Palestine from the 1940s uh, was actually available online in a kind of scanned form, basically. And interestingly, through the Israeli National Library website. So they had this kind of slightly clunky viewer interface where you could take a map sheet um, and kind of see the contents of that. And they're very detailed maps, but there was something like 280 individual map sheets, and there was kind of no way of kind of knowing which sheet had which place on it. And we just kind of had this idea that there was this amazing opportunity. These maps usually kind of languish in archives. There's copies of them around the world, but very difficult to gain access. And the fact that we had these kind of quite high resolution scans of these maps, so that could be the start of a project that would allow us to make it much easier for people to kind of find places on these historic maps, compare them to present day conditions in across historic Palestine. And basically, we started this project. I couldn't put a date on it now. Actually, it's probably around. I'm going to say a rough guess would be 2016, possibly as late as 2017. Not really sure. I'm sure it's written up somewhere. It's going back a little bit way for me to find the beginning of it, but basically, we saw this opportunity to kind of create this project, and it was really a kind of what would you call it? A kind of work of kind of love for this kind of labor of love, let's say, for this possibility. And really, yeah, so basically it involved there's lots of kind of technical GIS terms around it, but basically georeferencing these maps, we had to kind of crop them to standard sizes. We had to figure out the precise coordinates of the corners of them, and basically merge them all together, project them onto a projection that would be compatible with present day satellite imagery and mapping, and then combining that with data sets on historic places. So from the likes of Salman Abu Sitta, from the likes of Zokhrot, and kind of various other sources. I think I should mention probably Palestine Remembered as well was a source of data for that. And basically, what we tried to do with the website was to have this kind of layered approach that you could, um, take the historical base maps, overlay present day geography on that, put it side by side with present day satellite imagery, to be able to kind of find and search for over 1,000, I think, locations from historical and present day, and then actually to be able to download the individual map sheets as well in high resolution. So that was kind of where we reached with the project. We have, there were some spin-off projects from that, which I probably could discuss also, but I won't start with that. But yeah, so that's kind of where the project reached, and there are lots of other ideas to kind of expand that project, but it's very much kind of on a voluntary basis at this point. It's a kind of labor of love in spare time. So
Wow, thank you. Thanks, Ahmad. Can you, before we move forward, share with us some anecdotes about some of the challenges or the main challenges you have faced or may be facing in producing this project? Things that you feel also speak to maybe the politics of what you might be doing and some of the decisions you've had to take. And regarding that, I think Mikaram will have a follow up.
sure. So in terms of we didn't face major kind of technical challenges to what we were doing. So things I guess fitted together fairly well. I think that there's a massive challenge of I mentioned like multiple data sources for locations on the maps. Obviously, none of these are consistent with each other. I didn't mention also that we took present day data from both from the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics and the Palestinian Authority, State of Palestine Bureau of Statistics, as well. And we never really finished the process of merging this data together because, to be honest, like the maps are never completely consistent with what's there. The names of places change. Obviously, more than 500, villages and towns were wiped off the map during and after the Nakba. So I guess there were big challenges on that, of this kind of trying to figure out a kind of schema for organizing that information and not really leaving anything out, because you also have, for example, the database of Salman Abu Sitta. It includes a lot of Bedouin Palestinian locations in the south of Palestine, which don't really appear on maps, because it may be that they're seasonal. It may be just that the people who are mapping it didn't consider these to be something worthy of mapping. So there's a lot of things that don't appear on those official maps that we have tried to kind of retain in the information you can search. So there's not like a one-to-one match between what you can search for and what you can see on the maps.
And is there anything before Mikaram jumps in? Would you like me to share any of the images that we have, or is there a particular image that you would like us to feature?
I can't honestly remember exactly which images I sent to you. I think there was quite a nice one of some people using the maps in an exhibition.
Yes. Here we go. So it's basically looking at the two people looking through via their cell phone. I think was taken at the exhibition, I'm assuming, and that's one of the images. Another image is basically an image of a large map at the exhibition. Somebody looking at this fantastical spread at presuming at the exhibition. And we also have the third one that is titled Malsoum, and this is basically a textured production of a map. This is something that basically would was at the exhibition. I'm assuming you are able to see this. But these are really fascinating, and frankly, causes us to want to go over and take a look, a deeper look at what also is in store. And it's, of course, I'm assuming on palopenmaps.org, which is on the screen.
Yeah, I've also shared some links that hopefully can go out with the
Yes,
show notes. However,
we
this is managed. I think
we are.
I belatedly shared them with you. So
Yes,
I should say, yeah, that what the 3D images you're seeing is, it's like I mentioned that there were some projects that kind of came out of Palestine Open Maps, and this one was the exhibition. It included Palestine Open Maps, and it was entitled. I've got a visitor in the room. 1 second.
I believe it was a national monument is the title.
yeah. I'll add also this.
I'm going to sneak in with my follow-up
Can I
question.
can I just say something? 1 second, Macadam. Every link that we have here, basically from both Girish and Ahmad, will be featured in the final post that will appear on Jadaliya with all of the information that that it contains. And Girish, I'll bring you in for a moment here. Uh,
Sorry about that.
no worries at all.
Just with intervention from the kids.
We're not supposed to have
Um,
a show without these sorts of things. This is awesome. I was saying, Ahmed, that we will include all of the links in the final post that you have shared with us. And Garish, I understand that we have. I see them actually right here. We have a number of maps, also from, or sorry, links from you that are extremely worthwhile, including teaching material and other links that are fantastic resources. So we will include those in the final post, which will end up being circulated perhaps even more than the live feed over a long period of time. If that's okay, I'm getting this permission publicly from both of you. Sorry, Makarim, go ahead.
Yeah, so Ahmed, I am very lucky to actually be using the Palestine Open Maps for some of my work because I'm an urban planning student. So, as I'm doing some GIS work, having these to georeference against redevelopment maps that I have from the archives, it's a really great resource. And I know that on top of the maps, you also have the points depicting villages and localities and color coded based on where they depopulated, and rebuilt. And this is a very small and maybe minor question, but how did you select the precise location of that point? Was it based on the geographic center of these villages? How did you determine that geographic center? Is it just the center of the polygon of the village? Or was it more about, okay, this is the economic center of this space? Because what a center has so many different meanings, and I'm curious how that played out into your selection for those points.
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I wouldn't say that any of very few of the points are that precise. And I think, yeah, largely we kind of adopted the locations that we received from different sources. And there are cases where we moved them slightly because they seem to be, placed in error. I think the only place where there's a kind of question about where is the point in terms of the level of detail of the map and the size of the place on it would be in the cities. So where you do really need to choose a location. And it is a tricky one. So, for example, if you go to Jerusalem, Quds, I think that if I remember correctly, the British had a preference of choosing something like Jaffa Gate as the center point. But you could choose, Haram al Sharif. You could choose, the Dome of the Rock as a center point, or you could choose Damascus Gate, or just pick a kind of geometric center of the old city or something like that. But I have to say, yeah, it's not something we really kind of dug deep into, and a lot of the locations, they're not perfectly matched up, to be honest. So they'll be useful enough in kind of finding you the approximate location of locality, and you can usually find the place on the map. And another thing is transliteration, but there's a lot of variation, and they're not. We didn't figure out a way to really to make them all consistent, and I feel like there was also some inconsistencies in the maps themselves.
Right. Yeah. Great. Yeah, thank you. I mean, as someone who's looking at these maps for ages and georeferencing, it's nice to have some of that inside knowledge of what goes into making these decisions, if the decisions are one that you're really able to make or not.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the national monument photos that Bassem had just put up on the screen. I'm curious what you think about, I understand it's an offshoot of the Palestine Open Maps projects. I'm curious what the scale impact has, if if you're able to speak on that, of, we have this massive scale, the difference of viewing it on a small computer. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess with the exhibition, there's two or three parts of it. There was one was just the kind of digital access to Palestine Open Maps, the website. Another was the kind of three-dimensional pieces we created with the artist Marwan Oshmawi. So there are these basically topographic wooden blocks, and we created them for the largest 20 cities in pre-48 Palestine. And that was a kind of space that they were laid out at the same scale as the maps, so 1 to 20,000 scale, the kind of most detailed maps, to give this kind of the three-dimensional sense of the topography of Palestine, as well as the geographic locations. And I think that's something that's that you don't always see with Palestine, is that it has quite a what would you call it? Spectacular like topography in a lot of the country. You kind of have the coastal plain, and the south is fairly flat, but you have like the West Bank, and the north, the Galilee is very hilly or even mountainous. So it kind of creates some completely different effect. And the third room in the exhibition was this kind of map room, where we had the maps printed at original size and kind of cropped and placed together as a continuous map. So kind of what you see on the website, but at full scale, as it were. And for me, to be honest, with all the work we put into the others, I think that was the room that was kind of the unique experience of being there on some level, possibly because I was involved in the production of all the other things. But it was the first time like actually seeing these maps at full scale, that I'd been working with them probably for a year and a half at that time. At least I would say at least a year and a half. And later we actually had an opportunity. We did this original exhibition was at Dar al-Nimr in Beirut, and we did a follow-up exhibition in Jameel Arts Center in Dubai. And there we actually printed all of the maps that we had, covering like half of Palestine, the northern part. They didn't have the detailed maps in the south, and we printed them all out at the original scale. So this wall that you can see in the exhibition was about a quarter of the maps or something like that we had. And then in the second exhibition, we actually laid them all out on the floor, so you could walk over the maps on vinyl and actually kind of inspect them at original scale. And it is a very different experience to kind of zooming in and out on the web.
Right. Oh, what I would have given to be able to see these exhibitions would be phenomenal.
I should say that Makarim has been so excited about this episode that she got me. I mean, I was excited too, but she got me even more excited. So, Makarim, feel free to jump in. I know when we were brainstorming, you had a lot of ideas and questions. You probably can like stay on the call after we finish the show for quite some time. Although I think these people have families and lives, so
I'd be happy to stay on that. Yeah.
go ahead, Makarim. I know you have at least another.
Yeah, I'm also wondering, I guess the reception of this project amongst the GIS and cartographic communities. If you've had any sense of how it's been received and used. I mean, I know amongst my peers, in GIS courses, it's one that people point to quite often. So I'm curious what you've seen as the reception.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked that question because it allows me to talk about the mapathons that we had in relation to Palestine Open Maps. So, um, my one of my partners on the project, Majd Shehabi, organized a series of mapathons where the purpose was so we've kind of made these maps navigable, but the actual original features on the maps beyond just the locations of the cities are not digitized. So basically, Maj started this project of trying to actually trace all of these features and code them in the same way that you would code like OpenStreetMap.
Mhm.
So we got a copy of the software basically behind OpenStreetMap to allow us to digitize all of the kind of features on those historical maps. And Majd organized a series of maybe possibly as many as 20 mapathons around the world to bring people into that process of digitization because there's so many features on those maps. It's not really the work
Mhm.
of one person.
Right.
Um, so what was really interesting in that is that the process of organizing these mapathons, it was amazing the kind of breadth of people that were interested to host the mapathons, to be involved in those mapathons. Apart from the kind of community of people interested in Palestine specifically, you also had, for example, there's like a humanitarian OpenStreetMap community, and they do run mapathons to map areas that for humanitarian purposes. So if there's like a humanitarian emergency, they bring a group of people together to improve the maps available on OpenStreetMaps for that area, that part of the world.
Mhm.
And a couple of the mapathons were hosted by those kind of groups. And I think there was also people involved in kind of indigenous mapping seem to have kind of got word of this project. So I came across my other half was connected with someone in Brazil who was doing kind of indigenous rights work,
Mhm.
and he was already aware of the project somehow or other. I think I've heard of people in India, I'm trying to remember the different locations who have kind of connected with this project in one way or another. So it's been really interesting, and I haven't like honestly been aware of that much kind of uh, let's say pushback about the kind of content and controversy of the project, but I think
Mhm.
it's partly because it's an independent project. It's not kind of associated with an institution, maybe.
Right.
I'm not completely sure. We had, around some of the mapathons, we were concerned there might be, not infiltration, like, I mean, they're public events, but there was, I think, one of the ones in London, there were people kind of commenting online that they wanted to, sabotage the event or something, but it never happened. The event happened, but no sign of anyone trying to, sabotage things.
Mhm.
But really, that's the only instance I can think of.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, it's always great to have on my end as a student to have these all available and be able to point to it as, hey, look at this great open source resource. And instead of having to go through the archive myself and trying to find which ones have good digitized qualities.
Yeah, and that was really what we wanted to do with the project, is we wanted to, open up access to the maps. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, it was very much about showing what's possible with them and allowing other people to come up with, creative and academic and whatever outlets for the maps.
Right, right.
Thank you, Ahmed. And we know that so much of the work you've done before, including the projects you were involved in, like visualizing Palestine and so on, have been extremely useful for both educators and researchers, and of course students, who have gobbled them up because they encapsulate in one image, not just information, but a state of being that we sometimes, either forget or is not always on our mind, as a result of, you know all the horrible things happening all over the world. So it's really been a fantastic source, and I really hope that you and your colleagues continue doing what you're doing. And before we close, I wanted to ask you about any kind of future projects or developments the team is hoping to add to this project, or any other projects that you want to discuss, something that might be in the works, uh,
Yeah.
and and if you can close. I know this is not part of, I mean, this is a little off as well, but what advice would you give for somebody, let's say my nephew, or somebody who's getting into college? I mean, tell us a little bit about how exciting this realm could be, to be taken up, especially in this new world of visualization and um, uh, basically the importance of visualization and visual stimulation, because there's so much competition, right? On the one hand, on the other hand, the way the new generation is consuming knowledge is very different than, for instance, the way I consume knowledge. So if you can tell us a bit about the future developments or projects, and maybe a word about, why is this important, in your own words, for to encourage people to sort of get into this realm, which can be, accessed or approached from, obviously, beyond just the social sciences.
That's a lot of stuff. Okay. To start with, like, what's next for the project? So a few possible things. I mean, like I say, it's very much something that's done in spare time. And I don't unfortunately have as much of that as I had a couple of years ago. And but some of the things, I mean, the website itself, we really want to make some improvements. It's a little bit clunky. There's some kind of weird bugs that we need to fix. But I think the biggest um, potential project coming forward is, so we've gotten, you mentioned, like, Jessica Holland. There's an exhibition that's being organised that Majd and I are supposed to be part of, in, I think it's as late as, I want to say it's 2024 that it's scheduled for. But the idea is to kind of build something that's involving, VR and kind of, or potentially augmented reality, around the kind of these maps, and adding kind of layers and kind of something in that space. And I think we're actually going to discuss it on a podcast kind of later this week. Well, not a podcast, another session later this week.
Yes, I will. I
So
will announce it before we close.
okay, yeah. So that's one of the things. I mean, so in terms of, specifically, new things coming out of that project. In terms of my own work, I mean, I think you mentioned at the start, I'm working with the Office for National Statistics in the UK, and that we have this kind of massive 10-year census. And that's, really the distraction that's taking me away from Palestine Open Maps. But, it's actually, interestingly, it's using a lot of the same, techniques, and facing some of the same challenges with the complexity of kind of British kind of mapping systems, and how geographies change over time. And actually all of that stuff is kind of embedded in kind of how the work I'm doing on that. And I think in terms of the next, uh, how to kind of start out in this space, it's a really tricky one, to kind of, to because it involves, I wouldn't see it as that complicated, but it might be quite overwhelming to think about what's the starting point of kind of going into this realm. I mean, one thing is obviously to, take a GIS course. There's open source software like QGIS, that allows you to kind of do a lot of things with digital mapping, and that's, one place to start. Um, Another is, I mean, there's so much kind of open source kind of web mapping um, technology out there, but there is a bit of a learning curve because there's kind of just understanding how to kind of program for the web is kind of your kind of base um, entry point there, and combining that with the kind of GIS, and then you're able to kind of build these web apps. So it's quite a heavy foundation, but once you've kind of got the to grips with those, there's some really amazing things you can do with the technologies that are there, and what's actually open source, basically, that not proprietary expensive software in order to be able to get started in this space. I think I'm not fully aware of kind of all the different kind of courses and what would you call it, resources available online, but I know there are a lot. So just kind of searching in that space for GIS and web mapping. I'm sure there's some good kind of 101 stuff out there.
Absolutely. I actually I keep thinking about this because frankly, because of the job market out there and the kind of options that are faced by younger artists or younger activists or intellectuals or what have you, or all of the above, who might actually be much more enthusiastic about maybe college, about a career, as they understand these different options. I personally feel that this is a phenomenal way of communicating knowledge, of transmitting politics, right? I mean, especially, hopefully, good politics that benefit the majority of human beings. I mean, that's just my quick definition, as opposed to a minority or a smaller portion. So that would be the thank you for that, and I hope that we can continue to speak about these issues with all of you. This has been, for me, really remarkable, and we definitely would love to invite you both again. We will also be inviting you to come and say a word or two on our monthly live broadcast, Live with ASI, where we actually go over the knowledge production and the events that we have conducted the month before or produced, and it ends up actually giving this or all of the respective podcasts and articles and publications that we feature a huge push because of the importance of repetition these days, in terms of putting things in front of people so that they can see it if they had missed it. So I really thank you so much, Ahmed, for this. And you're in London, right now?
Near enough, south coast of England.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, in the general vicinity, because I would love to see you again, and I will contact you about meeting, hopefully. And Girish,
Awesome.
it's such a pleasure to meet you. And I mean, Ahmed is part of our networks at the Arab Studies Institute, and of course, at the co-sponsors of this podcast, which include KPP and MESPI, as well as the Middle East Studies, Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason. But Girish, this is the first time I meet you personally, and you're gonna be hounded by so many of us at ASI for and it's your fault for all of the knowledge that you have imparted, and the politics that you have imparted. And we would love to speak with you again about various other topics, and kind of like reel you in to our pedagogy project, and look at Makarim smiling. She knows that we're gonna
That's my default face.
reach out for you. Yeah, but I can read the behind the scene variations of the default. Okay.
Well, Girish, I know you have to run, so thank you so
Yeah,
much for taking the time, being flexible with the scheduling. It's such a wonderful opportunity to talk with you about this.
absolutely. Thank you very much, Girish. And is it Girish? Just so that we all are Girish. Okay. Thank you so much. And we'll let you go, and we'll say goodbye to Ahmed so that you can have salam. Uh, any last words, Makarim, for Ahmed or for the show?
No, thank you so much. It was wonderful to be able to actually talk with you about Palestine Open Maps because it's been an open tab for about 3 weeks on my computer. So
Right.
Awesome,
I'd
awesome.
be happy to talk about it offline as well. So yeah,
great,
if it
wonderful.
relates
Absolutely.
to your work, then yeah, absolutely happy to.
Shukran, shukran, Ahmed, and thank you so much, Mikarim, for being so awesome and bringing a lot of seriousness to the podcast. My approach is always super casual, and I appreciate your systematic bent. Ahmed, we will see you soon, and thank you all very much for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Salam.